as I mentioned a few times, I'm giving a class presently in the Ramban's disputation at Barcelona, and I just want to mention there was a very interesting political repercussion, and that is the Ramban refused to participate in any debate about Christianity unless he was given full immunity from prosecution for anything that he said, and the king granted him that immunity. But then when the Ramban wrote up a record of the proceeding, which he then circulated, he was prosecuted because they told him the immunity only extended to the oral statements and not to their written dissemination. And he was actually up for a death sentence, but the king happened to like him, so it was changed to exile, and that is why the Ramban came to Eretz Israel. So,
would you participate in a debate like that, Rabbi Breitowitz?
I would not out of principle, but because I'm not a great debater, and therefore I would not want to do anything that would, God forbid, undermine. I'm not a rhetorician or whatever it would be, so I would not want to do it for that reason. Although I'm happy, again, I'm happy to talk about Christianity. I do it, but not in a debate format, so to speak.
Did you say you're teaching a shiur about the disputation?
Yeah, it's almost finished. We Rabbi Wine's show, we have a class in the different Sfarim, so it happens to be we're doing the disputation at Barcelona. It's very short. It's only around 10 pages.
At the OU Center? Or where?
No, it's at Rabbi Wine's show. Okay. All right. Beit Knesset Hanasi. Okay, anyway, I hope everyone is well. And again, if I can start with another digression, I overheard while I was davening that some questions were raised about Devorah. And this is not, of course, the Devorah, the judge of Tanakh, but this is a Devorah that is only mentioned once in the whole Torah. And she is described as the Meineket Rivka, the nursemaid of Rivka. And her death is memorialized. Her death, she's buried in a certain place on the road. It's called Alon Bachut, the tree of crying and sobbing. And remember, even Rivka's own death is not mentioned, and Leah's death is not mentioned, and Bilhah and Zilpah's death is not mentioned. Only Sarah and Rachel and Devorah, who is only Meineket Rivka. And there are different reasons that are given, but I just want to share with you a thought that I saw one of the commentaries gives. And that is, Devorah is actually one of the great, great unsung heroes in the Torah. Because here we have this little girl, Rivka, who was raised in a corrupt, idolatrous, immoral environment. And somehow Rivka was pure and righteous, and she was a fitting wife for Yitzchak and to be a founder of Klal Yisrael, giving birth to Yaakov, Esau as well, but Yaakov and then the 12 tribes. What was the secret? If you look in the literature of resilience, it's a whole psychological school. You have kids who grew up in gangs, kids who grew up in broken families. Some children are just broken. They get into drug addiction, they get into gangs, they get killed. And other people make it, like Ben Carson, for example, came from that type of background. And the literature says that the most important factor in determines whether a kid will be able to transcend the limitations of his environment is, was there an adult who truly cared about them and directed them in a good and a moral way? Sometimes that could be the mother in a lot of these broken families, and sometimes it's a father figure who goes to baseball games and plays basketball, etc. Devorah was, in a sense, the spiritual figure in Rivka's life. We know nothing about Devorah. We don't know where she came from. We don't know why she was a righteous woman. But Devorah was the person who made Rivka Rivka. And the lesson of that is that sometimes a person's destiny is not focused on what they themselves accomplish in the world, but the fact that they enabled somebody else to become great. The stories, for example, there are great, great Rosh Yeshivas in the world, great leaders of Torah, who may have come from backgrounds which were not so great, not so religious. But they had, in 5th grade, a Talmud Torah teacher, or a Rebbe that inspired them. And that Rebbe lived his life in relative obscurity, maybe in a small town somewhere. He taught in a conservative day school, or maybe even an Orthodox day school, but never became famous, never became somebody that the whole Torah world looks at. And yet, it's precisely those figures behind the scenes that are often the inspirations for those who become very, very pivotal in the history of Am Yisrael. And the prototype of that idea, which you might call the hidden hero, the person who is not celebrated for their direct accomplishments, but because they enabled others to become great, is exactly this Devorah. A humble, unassuming person of whom we know nothing about at all. And yet the Torah records her death, because her leaving the world was a genuine loss. The genuine loss of a force for good in a quiet, relatively unknown way. So it's something to think about. Sometimes people might get frustrated. Certainly people in chinuch, in Jewish education, are often frustrated if they're in small towns or whatever it is, and they don't necessarily feel or see that they're accomplishing great things. But sometimes just the effect you have on one single person can ultimately be of enormous significance, not only to that person, but indeed to Klal Yisrael as a whole. So that's kind of the message of Devorah that this commentary wanted to bring out. And again, it's a very, very meaningful message, because I remember in my own life, people who labored in relative obscurity their whole lives, and yet they were really a tremendous force for good on so many people who grew up and had families and ripple effects and did many, many different accomplishments, and it's all to their credit. Okay, so that was just a little bit of a digression about Devorah. Parshas Vayishlach and the Haftorah Vayishlach. It's interesting, the Haftorah Vayishlach, you can actually make a siyum on a book of Nach. It is the shortest book of Tanakh. Is the book of Ovadia. He is one of the 12 prophets, and the entire book is only one perek, and that is the Haftorah for Parshas Vayishlach. So we read the whole book of Ovadia as the Haftorah. Ovadia himself was a convert who was descended from Esav, and he was given the mission of prophesying about the eventual destruction of Esav with the coming of Mashiach. So basically, connecting the Haftarah to the Parsha, obviously in the Parsha we read about the encounter of Yaakov and Esav after many years of separation. And Chazal used to read Parshat Vayishlach for many, many lessons of dealing with the Roman authorities, because Chazal had a Masorah. It's not so clear how you trace it, that the Romans were the descendants of Esav. And it's not entirely clear from the Tanakh itself where you get that yichus. Some have suggested that the Edomites were the Etruscans, that were the people in Italy before the Romans, and when the Romans interbred with the Etruscans, you have in effect Edomite blood in Rome. Nevertheless, it's a well-known established Masorah in Chazal that Edom is identified with Rome, and this goes back to the famous theme of the 4 exiles: the Babylonian exile, the Persian exile, the Greek exile, and the Roman exile, the Galut of Edom. And those are the people who are identified as destroying the Second Temple. Obviously, Edom is identified with the Roman Empire itself. So whenever the Chachamim had to have meetings with the government of Rome, whether it was the emperor or lesser officials, they always studied Parshat Vayishlach to determine what types of interactions should we have with the Edomites, with the ruling authorities. And the most famous statement, there are many statements in Chazal, but the most famous statement is a medrash that says, Yaakov Avinu prepared 3 strategies for dealing with Edom. Strategy number 1 was doron, gift-giving, bribery, so to speak. He was sending gifts to Esav to put Esav in a favorable state of mind. Plan B was to wage war if necessary. If we need to defend ourselves by violence, by bloodshed, we will do so. And plan C, which is necessary both for plan A and plan B, is to turn to God in prayer, as Yaakov Avinu prayed. So we initially start off with peace and overtures and generosity. We are prepared for war as a necessary evil if that becomes necessary. And we need HaKadosh Baruch Hu's siyata d'shmaya no matter which way we go. So there is a thought that these 3 derachim are not simply how we deal with the Edomites in particular, but how do we deal with secular culture in a general way, right? Because we live in a world in which there are many, many values that are antithetical to the Torah. And the question is, what is my relationship and what is my family's relationship to secular culture, literature, art, music, science. What do I do? So in truth, there are sometimes two opposite responses. There is a response within Klal Yisrael that wages unrelenting war. I don't mean by bloodshed, but the unrelenting rejectionism against anything that is not within the four amos of the Beis HaMidrash. Right? So war is the stance of rejection. I don't allow it in my home. I want my home to be inviolate. I want my environment to be pure. No computers, no internet, no cell phones, etc. That's one response. There's another response, which is called gift giving, in which I welcome everything in. I want to create an open environment. And what the Torah is suggesting is that this should not be an all or nothing, meaning to say those who wage unrelenting war are making a serious mistake. Because after all, as Chazal tell us, Chachma Bagayim, if someone tells you, is there wisdom among the Gentiles, or there is wisdom among the Gentiles, Tamin, you have to believe it. There is wisdom, there is insight, there are things that we can learn, insights, of course, in science, technology, mathematics, literature, psychology. There are many, many things. You know, the world has not been dormant, the world has not been stagnant, and there have been things outside of the framework of Orthodox Jews that are meaningful, that are productive, that can enhance our religious experience, as well as enhancing the practicalities of our lives. So milchama is not a complete response, nor is doron. Doron is gift-giving, which is symbolic of I welcome everything. Meaning, the philosophy that says I reject everything and the philosophy that says I accept everything is incorrect. There needs to be a synthesis and there needs to be an integration. Yaakov adopted both strategies, not one or the other. He adopted the strategy that there are some things I'm going to reject, and then there's a strategy that there are some things I'm going to accept.
Who's giving the gift?
Huh?
The
Well,
Gentiles?
in the Chumash, Yaakov is giving the gift.
But the paradigm is that the Gentiles give us a gift.
Right, but it's stretching it a little bit. The idea of gift giving is I am open to a relationship with you. I'm inviting a relationship with you. Now, Jews also have given the gift. Jews themselves have contributed to the greater civilization. Consider the Nobel Prizes that Jews have won and the like. So therefore, the concept of the war and the gift represent the synthesis of how we relate to secular culture. We have to have the wisdom to be able to incorporate that which is good and ennobling, and then we have to have the courage to be able to push away and reject that which is degrading and destructive to the human spirit. And it is only by prayer and connection to Hashem that we will be given the wisdom and the insight to make those discriminations. Because in a sense, it is always easier to be an all or nothing person. It's relatively easy to simply say, everything out there is bad, although practically you really can't live that way. I mean, after all, even in the most Haredi home, there will be a telephone, right? I mean, and a refrigerator. So nobody is rejecting the modern life totally. But whatever it is, philosophically, it's relatively easy to say everything's bad. And philosophically, it's relatively easy to say everything's fine. But wisdom consists of discrimination. And Chazal make this point very beautifully. Motzei Shabbos, we incorporate a Havdalah in the Amidah itself. Havdalah, God separates between the holy and the profane. In what bracha do we insert the separation of holy and profane? In the bracha dealing with knowledge and wisdom and understanding. And the Talmud Yerushalmi says, Im ein das, without discernment, Havdalah minayin, how will you know to discriminate? The mark of a refined mind is the ability to make discriminations and not to simply have wholesale rejection or wholesale acceptance, but to understand that there is a mixture of good and bad. There is that which ennobles, that which enhances, that which uplifts, that which creates beauty for the human spirit, and there is that which degrades and that which denigrates. And in creating your own family and your own community, you have to try to figure out, how do I have that balance? So in a sense, therefore, Yaakov's 3 strategies are kind of a prototype of how we deal with secular and non-religious culture, Christian culture, whatever you want to say. In fact, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who was really the rescuer, the redeemer of Orthodoxy in 19th century Germany. People don't realize that Germany had been a great Torah center. If you go back to the 16th century and earlier, great Gedolim were in Germany. In fact, Rashi for a time was in Germany. But with the rise of the Reform movement in Germany spread like wildfire. So there were great cities like Frankfurt and Hamburg in which there was barely a minion of Orthodox Jews. Barely a minion. And Rav Hirsch became the rabbi of the Orthodox rabbi of Frankfurt at a time when there were very, very few Orthodox Jews. And over a career that spanned 50 years, he built up his kehillah to around 2,000 families, but more than that, his writings are very immortal and still studied today. But he was a great community builder. We know him from his writings, but in fact he was very, very essential in the growth of Orthodoxy in Germany, and that community was largely destroyed in the Holocaust, except for the Washington Heights enclave and the like. And we know that Rav Hirsch developed a philosophy which is not accepted so much by the mainstream yeshiva world, particularly in Israel. And that philosophy is called Torah im Derech Eretz, which is TIDE, abbreviated T-I-D-E. And that was Rav Hirsch's idea, that although a Jew's primary allegiance is to God and to Torah, and not to secular wisdom, but we need to incorporate secular wisdom to be able to turn the lessons of the Torah into the practical lessons of life, and we should be able to draw insights from all the cultures in order to enhance our own religious and spiritual identity. This was in contradistinction to the dominant Orthodox religious philosophy of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, which more or less rejected secular wisdom in a number of ways. Again, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's at least in very, very general terms. Now, in establishing this idea of Torah and Derech Eretz, and of course it's interesting that after the Holocaust, the only congregation really that survived as an authentic Torah and Derech Eretz congregation was the Breuer Skila. Rav Breuer was the Rav in Washington Heights, Upper Manhattan, in New York. And it's interesting that most of the children and grandchildren of those Holocaust survivors went to Lakewood and they became full-time Torah scholars. And in effect, they repudiated the very philosophy of Torah and Derech Eretz that was the basis of their congregation. So, in fact, even the Rav of Breuer's at some banquet at one of the yard sites of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch basically said, Torah and Derech Eretz is dead. It's no longer a viable philosophy because of the decadence of popular culture. We need to emphasize full-time Torah learning. And some of the old-timers of the congregation, I mean, they were in their 90s and they were in walkers. They got up in protest and tried to leave the room because they felt, et tu brute. I mean, the very Rav of the Torah im Derech Eretz congregation is repudiating the idea of Torah im Derech Eretz. But be it as it may, without getting into the politics, Rav Hirsch points out, if you go back all the way to the Parsha of Noach, and if you remember that when Noach got drunk after the flood, so Noach was naked, his nakedness was exposed, and Chum noticed, and Chum mocked it, and Chum called his brothers to go and look at it, and the brothers walked backwards to cover up their father's nakedness. And as a result, Chum was cursed to be a slave. That has some implications. But Shem was blessed, and Yefes was blessed. And the blessing to Yefes is especially interesting. Yaft Elokim liyefes. May God give beauty to Yefes. V'yishkam, and he will dwell, B'ohalei Shem, in the tents of Shem. In English that sounds bad, but in Hebrew Shem is the name. May he dwell in the tents of Shem, the son of Noach. Now Yefes, we know, was the ancestor of Yavan, Greece. Greece, of all of the ancient cultures, Greece was the one that most excelled in what you might call secular wisdom, whether it was philosophy, science, mathematics, art, drama, etc., even athleticism. Greece excelled in that. Greece was certainly a culture of great beauty, both aesthetic beauty and intellectual beauty, elegance. And Yefes is therefore the progenitor of Greece. So Yefes was given the mission to promulgate culture and beauty in the world. Shem was given the mission to promulgate ethical monotheism and submission to God. And thus Abraham comes from Shem. So what Noach envisions is a division of labor, and what Noach says, Yafte Elokim liyefes. God has given the gift of beauty to Yefes. And that beauty should dwell within the tents of Shem, meaning to say that the beauty of Yefes will be beautiful when it is coupled and connected to the ethical monotheism of Shem, and not when it is separated. So there's really two messages there. One message is that Shem is supposed to incorporate the beauty of Yefes into its life. And the other is a message to Yefes, that when you separate from Shem, then your beauty becomes destructive, egotistical, destructive, and damaging to the human spirit. Now this is a very, very important message about Hanukkah, because Hanukkah, in fact, coming up, is in fact the struggle of Am Yisrael against Yavan. Because remember that Yavan is not like Haman. Yavan, Antiochus, did not try to destroy us physically. Antiochus tried to destroy us. Well, let me put it this way. Obviously, it turned into a war. I mean, Antiochus eventually turned the struggle into a war. But initially, it was not a war. Initially, it was simply a desire for assimilation, homogenization, adoption of Greek values. And it is the struggle against Yavan by advocating ethical monotheism. But in point of fact, it's not so much that we are rejecting Yavan, but rather we are rejecting the uncoupling of Yavan from the message of Shem. Otherwise, Yafte Elokim liyefes, Yefes and Yavan represent beauty when it is Yishkon B'olei Shem. Right? And that is what Yaakov Avinu is merames when he's saying, there is that which we reject, but there also must be that which we accept. And through tefillah, we will try to get an insight and an understanding into ourselves as to what is the proper balance for our children, for our families, for our communities, for our schools. Chachma b'goyim tamin is a reality. One cannot deny that teaching, but one has to know how to separate the good from the bad. That is not an easy question, and that is not a question that even has a single answer across the board. It may vary from person to person, from family to family. There are certain ideas that can genuinely help some people. There are other ideas that could be very destructive and damaging. It takes a great deal of wisdom and refinement. Part of what we sometimes encounter in Eretz Yisrael is the inability to make distinctions. Either one goes to one extreme or another. We are a country of extremism in almost everything. And the truth of the matter is, you can call this being a milquetoast or being a nerd or whatever it would be, or a wimp, but in truth, MS is normally going to be somewhere in the middle where you combine different perspectives and you draw truths from all sides. Of course, as the Kotzker Rebbe famously remarked, when you walk in the middle of the road, you will get hit by traffic moving in both directions. So it is dangerous to walk in the middle of the road, but the middle of the road is probably where the MS lies. And this is what Yaakov is doing when he's combining Milchama and Doran. Now there's another point. Yeah.
The Rosh said that, quote the Chadal, Chacham Goyim Tamin, and then it also says Torah
B'goyim Al Tamin, right?
What's the distinction between the two?
Yeah, so apparently the concept would be that when it comes to understanding things, That is called Chachma, and the non-Jewish world contributes to our understanding of everything, whether it's science, whether it's technology, philosophy, literature, music. There can be a contribution. But Torah is the ultimate guide to what is your spiritual role in the world. And there, you have to look at Torah as your source of values, of ethical values, and then, based on that core of values, you then ask yourself, what chachma can help me deepen my values and the like. But the values themselves have to emerge from Torah. And this was a point that Rav Hirsch himself made over and over again. Torah im Derech Eretz is not a relationship of equality. There's Torah, Derech Eretz, and they're all equal. Rather, Torah is the source of your ethical vision. And you then look into the greater world to see how you can deepen and enlarge and apply your vision in the practicalities of life.
Why did he call it Derech Eretz?
Well, Derech Eretz, okay, this is an interesting point. Derech Eretz is not...
Why you is Torah Umada?
Yes, that's correct, that's
Okay,
correct.
everything you're talking about sounds
Yeah.
more like Torah Umada.
That's correct, that's correct. And maybe that is so. Rav Hirsch's... okay, let me put it this way. Everything I said is a clear definition of Torah Umada. No question about that. Torah Umada means Torah and knowledge. That's why Yeshiva University's motto. And Rabbi Norman Lamb, who unfortunately he's not very well, he should have a refuah, wrote a whole book called Torah Umada, in which he expands on this philosophy with great eloquence. Now, Rav Hirsch's philosophy from the 19th century actually went by a different name, Torah im Derech Eretz. And the question becomes, what exactly, are they different philosophies? Are they not different philosophies? So that itself is a machlokes, how to interpret Rav Hirsch. Some interpret Torah im Derech Eretz as just an earlier name for Torah Umada, and philosophically they are indistinguishable. Others do put a different spin, which is not the explanation I've been using tonight, in which they say that Rav Hirsch's orientation was much more pragmatic and practical, meaning he wanted people to have a parnasa, he wanted people to be economically self-sufficient. He was not so much emphasizing intellectually connecting to the outside world as he was simply emphasizing productive economic activity and the like. Based on that, there is a difference between Torah im Derech Eretz, which is really kind of a pragmatic adjustment to the world, such as trade schools for Charedim or whatever it would be, versus Torah Umada, which is a bit more grandiose in actually looking to secular wisdom as a source of insight and understanding. Now, it seems to me, though, in reading Rav Hirsch's own writings, it seems that Rav Hirsch did in fact endorse a valuable role for secular wisdom in deepening your understanding of life. So I would in fact equate Rav Hirsch to Torah Umada, even though Rabbi Lamb disassociates the two. But I think Rabbi Lamb wanted to have an original movement. But in fact, I think it's very much connected. By the way, people ask the question, well, aren't these just modern orthodoxy? Modern orthodoxy? Not really. They are the modern orthodoxy of Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Lichtenstein, yes. But typical modern orthodoxy is not a particularly intellectual movement at all. A typical modern orthodoxy is much closer, I'm going to use a harsh word, but I don't mean to be so harsh, I'm just using it for hyperbole. It is primarily a hedonistic movement, meaning to say it's simply a way of being able to go to the beach or whatever it would be. Meaning, if you have a Rav Soloveitchik, if you have a Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, these were people who genuinely mastered the intellectual canon of the West and tried to figure out what they could draw from that wisdom to enhance their avodas Hashem. And their avodas Hashem was absolutely serious. It was serious and it was deep and it was a conscientious, difficult endeavor. But as people say, maybe there's only two modern Orthodox Jews. I'm exaggerating with some of that ilk, and that was Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. Typically, modernity in Judaism, in many cases, again, I'm really exaggerating, and I'm being very, I'm stereotyping and being overgeneral, but in many, many cases, it is not really an intellectual movement at all. It is simply a movement to give you greater freedom in how you live your life. So it's not really connected to Torah Derech Eretz or Torah Umada. There's going to be a correlation. Many modern Orthodox subscribe to Torah Derech Eretz and Torah Umada, but they are not the same. Modern Orthodoxy tends to be focused on behavioral freedom as opposed to intellectual depth and exploration of what modernity can add to the Jewish tradition. So all of these names have different implications. And of course, there's open Orthodox. Those are, again, I don't want to get into all of the names. They say that the Eskimos have 300 words for different types of snow because they need to know every different type of ice and snow, etc. So they're very sensitive to nuances that other people wouldn't notice. So too, we have 300 varieties of Judaism, and it gets very, very confusing after
Would
a
the
while.
label of hedonism also apply to conservative and Reform Judaism?
Again, I'm really overgeneralizing, and of course there are many, many exceptions. But yeah, I think to a large extent. I remember I once participated in a symposium with conservative and Reform rabbis. And my own yeshiva was absolutely furious. They threatened to revoke my smicha. So, they really were very, very against my doing it. But I did it. I don't know if I would do it again, but I did it. And the experience was very, very fascinating because, I presented what I thought was the Torah position, and they presented the Orthodox, the conservative and Reform position. And the reaction from the audience was fascinating. There was a Reform guy who got up, and he said to his rabbi, he says, listen, I'm a Reform Jew because I'm lazy. I'm a Reform Jew because, it's too hard for me to keep Shabbos and keep kosher, so I don't. So I do what I do. But how can you philosophically, he was saying, how can you philosophically justify it? I don't understand it all. The philosophy was incoherent and it's inconsistent. And you say, well, God told us some things and not other things. So it's interesting that here the Reform guy openly admitted that he is a Reformed Jew not because of ideology and not because of belief, but because of convenience. And he accused his rabbi of having an incoherent philosophy. So that's kind of it, basically, in which it becomes a lifestyle decision. Now, again, we Orthodox people are guilty of that too. We have a lot of compromises in our personal religious life, which are not necessarily out of principle. So it's a question of degree, right? In other words, so good, we're not going to drive on Shabbos. But there are plenty of things we do that, if you really followed the Shulchan Aruch b'diuk, perhaps we shouldn't be doing. So, so I don't want to cast stones. I don't want to look down at anyone. I don't want to be negative on anyone. But I can say that a lot of religious decisions that everybody makes are not always matters of principle, and they're not always consequences of a well-thought-out philosophy, but they are matters of convenience and a certain degree of laziness that all of us have in some areas. On the other hand, Torah Umada, Torah Derech Eretz, are not lazy philosophies. They are actually very strenuous endeavors to try to figure out truth by considering all of the different sources that God put into the world, first and foremost Torah, but then looking at the world, looking at science, looking at mathematics, looking at philosophy, looking at the struggles that great thinkers have had over the years and how their struggles and their ruminations can inform the way we deal with life issues. Yeah.
The Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, wrote an essay in which he postulated that the Enlightenment, the Haskalah, that ultimately generated the Reform movement, happened not because people had a loss of faith or just an interest in losing God, but it happened because the Enlightenment opened up a host of possibilities for Jews to be free in the world, to have parnasa, to be a part of the world. And that was a very exciting proposition. And the only thing is that they couldn't do it if they observed Shabbos. You couldn't do business, you couldn't have commerce, you couldn't have all the culture. So if that's the case, if the Rav is correct there, then I think that Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, in his Torah and Derech Eretz, was really addressing that issue. He needed to combat this feeling and saying, no, you want to go into business, you want to be a part of the world,
Right.
so that's the Derech Eretz.
Yeah.
So I would go toward that explanation rather than the secular wisdom.
Okay, I think you have some truth there. If you look at Rav Hirsch's seminal work on Torah and Derech Eretz, which he wrote anonymously, and this is called the 19 letters, the very first letter, again, Rav Hirsch wrote all the letters, but the very first letter was written by a Jew who was alienated from Orthodox Judaism because he wanted to participate in the modernity of culture and all the exciting developments. And Rav Hirsch actually put these words into this this person, this character, the straw man, in which the person was vituperative. He was attacking Judaism as full of superstition and being old-fashioned and not participating in the glories of science and philosophy and all the new opportunities that finally have taken the Jews out of the ghettos. In other words, that was the accusation, and that was only one letter, and then the other 18 letters are Rav Hirsch responding to how Judaism can enable you to function successfully in the modern world. So I think Rav Soloveitchik's point is borne out by the 19 letters themselves, a very, very interesting book to read. On the other hand, let me give you a little example. Rav Hirsch established a system of religious schools in Frankfurt. And in his elementary school, they celebrated the German poet Schiller, non-Jewish, a very famous German poet. They celebrated his birthday with a public assembly in which they would read and even sing some of his poems. So clearly Rav Hirsch did have a certain attraction towards the German romantic culture. It says he even went to the opera, etc. Like all complex great thinkers, you can find different nuances in this thought. But your point is very well taken. Rav Soloveitchik's point is certainly very, very relevant on what Rav Hirsch was trying to do. But be it as it may, certainly when you go to Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Soloveitchik, you are moving to a Torah Umada idea in which Chachma Bagoyim becomes an independent source for knowledge and understanding. As I say, this is highly relevant to the Hanukkah story, because if you go to the yeshiva world, the Hanukkah story will be portrayed over and over and over again as the struggle of Judaism against Greece, which of course it is. It is. But the struggle is a bit more subtle than you might think. It's not that Greece is totally bad, Yavan bad, Judaism good. Rather, the concept was there has to be a way to selectively incorporate Yavan within Yadus, as opposed to the Yavan that tries to extinguish Yadus, and you have to be very, very careful. Too much of a good thing can be very destructive, and one has to know how to strike the balance. In fact, Maharal himself makes this point. Maharal points out that Yavan, if you rearrange the letters, spells Noi, Nun, Vav, Yud, which is beauty, but the words Yud, Vav, Nun, which we read Yavan, but it comes from a shoresh of own, to oppress, which means Yavan can become a stranglehold and an oppression, or it can be a great source of beauty, depending on whether you integrate it, the Olei Shem, or you separate it from Olei Shem. And Rizal Salanter, talking about Haskalah, Rizal Salanter gave a mashal about Haskalah, that when you have a team of wild horses that has been confined for a very long time, and you open up the gates, they are just going to run, and there's no way to stop them. You have to understand, Jews were confined and limited for so many decades, if not centuries, that when they finally got that freedom, they kind of went stir crazy. They just abandoned everything. The same thing happened with the large-scale immigration to the United States, where people threw over their tefillin and as they got to Ellis Island, right? Because they're finally given freedom. Now, freedom is a tremendous blessing. Thanksgiving is coming up. I don't know if how many of you are celebrating Thanksgiving or whatever it is. On one hand, freedom is a tremendous blessing. And Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote how we owe a debt of gratitude, those of us who are Americans, to the United States for creating an environment where we were able to live and prosper and accomplish and keep our religion and have economic security and economic prosperity. And that's a great thing. One does not turn your back on that. At the same time, freedom can also be toxic. You're like a wild horse that finally gets liberated, and you simply go crazy with it, right? So now that's not America's fault. We shouldn't blame America. It's our fault that we didn't always react properly to the freedoms that we were given.
Question?
But Hakaras Hatov, there still is. In fact, Rav Soloveitchik used to end shir early. He lived in Boston, but he was in New York a few times a week for his shir. So Thursday was one of his shir days. So he always started his shir early on Thanksgiving so he could fly back for Thanksgiving dinner. So there are 2 chidushim you learn from that. You have to learn 2 chidushim. Chiddush number 1 is he had a Thanksgiving dinner and he did not consider it to be imitating chukos hagoyim. That's chiddush 1. Chiddush 2 is he did not cancel his shir. He rescheduled it, meaning to say there was no reduction of Torah learning on Thanksgiving. He just made it earlier instead of later. The shir was the same 2 hours or 2.5 hours. So remember, you can't go with Chiddush 1 unless you go with Chiddush 2, right? So you got to keep both of the Chidushim together in that way. Yeah.
Does the introduction of the 5-day work week, and my history is very fuzzy on this subject, but doesn't that really mark the time when a Jew could be observant and function in secular society?
Well, it obviously made it tremendously easier. There's no question. But listen, even when Shabbos was a work day, many Jews, of course, did not keep Shabbos, but there were some courageous people who did. And if they didn't show up on Saturday, they had to look for a new job on Monday, they did it. These are really heroes, the unsung heroes. These are the people who founded the Young Israel movements. Again, maybe it was only a handful. That's very, very true. But nevertheless, they always were the Jews that were willing to give up everything in order to keep Shabbos. Okay. Now, I want to move to something else, and that is the night before Yaakov's great encounter with the angel, with Esav, he finds himself wrestling with a mysterious man who we discover in the course of the narrative is actually an angel, and they're wrestling all night. And sometimes Yaakov is on top, and sometimes the angel is on top. But finally, in the morning, Yaakov has him pinned down, and the angel says, and Yaakov says, "Give me a blessing." And the angel says, gotta go, let me go, I gotta give, Bali Musar like to point out a bit of a joke. When it comes to fighting Yaakov, the angel has plenty of time. He can spend the whole night fighting. As soon as Yaakov wants a blessing, the angel says, sorry, gotta go now. But okay, that's the way people are. But when it comes to machlokes, they're always willing to put in the time. When it comes to a bracha, they're in a rush. But Chazal tell us this angel had a one-time appointment to sanctify God's name, and if the time would pass, it would never come again. Okay. But be it as it may, I want to mention a few observations on this very mysterious entity. Chazal identify him as none other than the guardian angel of Esav himself, that somehow, the night before Yaakov encounters the physical Esav, Yaakov has to wrestle and struggle with some spiritual force that is Esav. And the Gemara has an interesting story. The Gemara asks, who did this angel resemble? So one opinion says, the angel resembled like an axe murderer, resembled a murderous criminal. The other opinion says, the angel resembled a pious, righteous person. And what's going on there? So some modern books, and I think, although I didn't see this in classical Meforshim, but I think they have an insight that's worth repeating. They suggest that part of the struggle that Yaakov is going through with the so-called angel of Esav is a struggle within the Esav of himself. It's a struggle within himself. Because Yaakov is confronting Esav in the flesh, but Yaakov himself knows that he's wronged Esav in a number of ways. He bought the birthright. He took advantage of Esav's starvation. He took away the blessings by deceiving and dressing up as Esav. in which that blessing was not available. And Yaakov is confronting an enemy that may want to destroy him. But Yaakov is going through the necessary struggle of the midnight. Am I worthy of these blessings? He is struggling with the demons of his own nature. Am I worthy? Am I righteous? Am I deserving? And the Torah is telling us that ultimately he came to a conclusion, he came to a resolution. God himself informed him that your struggle is a noble one, and through that struggle you will be uplifted. Your name shall no longer be Yaakov, which means the heel. Your name shall be Israel, the one who has struggled with God and prevailed. And other Meforshim already say this idea, that Yaakov refers to struggling and honestly looking at yourself, wrestling in the dirt, like a heel is in the dirt. That from the Yaakov, you come to a state of resolution and triumph. And that's what the Gemara means, that Yaakov is looking into himself, and he has two identities. He's the tzaddik and the righteous and the pure. But he's also a mirror image of the Esav himself. These two faces are the two faces of Yaakov. And Yaakov struggles to establish which identity is the real him. This is the cheshbon hanefesh that every person has to go through. Lonely, nobody else is around. You don't have the artificial chizuk of somebody patting you on the head and saying, you're okay, you're fine. You have the honesty to stare into the depths of our own mistakes, our own depravity, and then resolve how to try to turn it into something positive and something good. That's one thought. Another thought is from the Chafetz Chaim. So now we'll move back into more traditional interpretation. The Chafetz Chaim actually has two thoughts on this. Thought number one, why do we find that an angel only tries to attack Yaakov, and we don't find a parallel angel trying to attack Avraham and Yitzchak? So the Chafetz Chaim has a nice word. The Chafetz Chaim says, we know that Pirkei Avos tells us that the world stands on three pillars: Torah, Avoda, Torah, divine service, and Gemilas Chesed. And we know that each of the Avos represent one of those pillars. Avraham represents the foundation of loving kindness. And Yitzchak, who was a sacrifice, represents divine service. And Yaakov, who spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, represents unrelenting amelos in Torah. So here's what the Chafetz Chaim says. The koach of Esav that represents evil in the world is perfectly willing to let Jews grow in avoda and in gemilas chesed, because even though that is tremendously good, but it's not going to have intergenerational continuity. It is only with Torah that there's a certain continuity that Klal Yisrael will have, and therefore the Sarah Shal Esav only attacks Torah and not Chesed and not Avoda, because the Yetzer Hara looks at the long-term effect. Let Jews be righteous now if it's not going to last. Now, again, those of you that are American, if you know the history, at least of American Jewish life, you actually see this pattern very, very clearly. In the 19th century, in the 1880s, after the pogroms in Russia, that was the first major wave of Jewish immigration. I mean, there were Jews in America from before colonial times. But the first major wave, huge wave of thousands and thousands of Jews, was in the aftermath of the pogroms in Russia in 1880. There had been an earlier German immigration. In fact, the German Jews and the Polish Jews never got along, because the German Jews were very, very highly assimilated, the Polish Jews less so, and there was a lot of animosity. The German Jews were embarrassed by the Polish Jews. But initially, the first institutions that were established were what you might call chesed institutions, burial societies, fraternal aid, free loan societies, Jewish hospitals. There's no particular reason for a Jewish hospital today, but the Jewish hospitals date from that era when a Jew couldn't necessarily get treated in a regular hospital. So that was an emphasis on Chesed. And yet, that generation largely became assimilated, intermarried and assimilated. The next generation built magnificent synagogues that they don't build that way anymore. Beautiful stained glass windows, cathedral-like, but they kinesiot. So there was an emphasis on avodah, on tefillah, on decorum, on the beauty of the synagogue service. And a lot of those synagogues, not all, are now churches. You can go through any inner city, in a major American city, and you will see in big churches, you will see the Hebrew of the Ten Commandments etched into the wall, because these were once synagogues. They once were synagogues. The old shul in which I grew up, I think now it's torn down by now, but it became a church. And again, halachically, this is extremely problematic. I'm not going to get into the halachas of how you are allowed to do it. Many say you're not allowed to do it, but it was done all the time. So the Chafetz Chaim's prediction turned right. A Jewish society that emphasizes Chesed without Torah is not going to last. Avodah without Torah is not going to last. The rise and the success of the Orthodox community in the United States is a function of the establishment of a network of day schools by Torah and Sorah that started back in the 1940s, and now they have a Jewish day school in every Jewish community in the United States. There's at least 5,000 Jews. These are Orthodox Jewish day schools. And then with Torah and Sorah, then came yeshiva high schools and kollalim, because it makes a lot of sense. Intergenerational continuity is a function of learning Torah, studying Torah, understanding the values of Judaism. So the Chafetz Chaim said this a long time ago. The Chafetz Chaim said that let Avraham do his chesed, and let Yitzchak build his synagogues. Because they're doing a lot of good, but that good is not going to last. But Yaakov I must destroy, because Yaakov represents education. Yaakov represents Torah. Torah is continuity. Torah is nitzchiyut. Nitzchiyut, I'm going to fight. That's the Chafetz Chaim's first point. The Chafetz Chaim then makes a second point, that the angel of Esav was not victorious, but the angel of Esav did have a partial victory. Yaakov is still around, but Yaakov in the morning is hobbling, limping. He got struck on the sciatic nerve, and he's not able to walk very well. The Zohar says the following idea. The Zohar says, just as the thigh supports the body, so the thigh represents those who support Torah. Yaakov represents Torah. The thigh of Yaakov represents the Tamchin D'Oraisa, those who support the Torah. So here's what the Zohar says, and the Chafetz Chaim expounds upon this. The angel of Esav was not successful in destroying Yaakov. There will always be Jews that will study Torah, even if they have to starve. They will remain committed, they will remain connected. But there will be, if I can mix metaphors, there will be an Achilles heel to the support of Torah, and that is the support of Torah will always be precarious. The partial victory of Esav is, you'll learn Torah, but you will not get the support that Torah needs. Ad Kedei Kach, the Chafetz Chaim says that any Jewish Torah institution that does not suffer financial pressure, you must question its authenticity. Because if it doesn't have any financial problems, maybe it's not a genuine Torah institution. Mm-hmm. So Baruch Hashem, most of the institutions that we regard as authentic do qualify for the Chafetz Chaim's definition.
Rabbi Poston, what do you say about that?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Yiboneh qualifies for that. So Baruch Hashem and the like. So people might say, well, wait a second here. So why should I give money for Torah education? Hashem says you're supposed to be limping. You're supposed to not be on a good foundation. Well, let me give you an analogy. Chava was cursed that she will give birth with great pain, labor pain. Now, in the 19th century, when anesthesia was developed for childbirth, there were actually Christian theologians, all of whom were men, who said women are not allowed to take anesthesia during childbirth because the Torah says to Chava, you are supposed to suffer. Now, the Jewish position is, without getting into natural medicine or alternative medicine, but putting those issues aside, a curse is not the same as a commandment. In other words, God did not say, thou are obligated to suffer. Hashem created a teva, Hashem created a nature. It is the nature of things that childbirth has a great deal of physical suffering. Hashem created a nature. But we are permitted to alleviate pain and suffering, just as we do in every case of sickness. We don't regard a propensity, even a curse, as a divine commandment that it has to be this way. It is simply a declaration of what is the natural starting point, which we are then allowed to try to alleviate and moderate. Same thing here. It is true that God has given Esav a partial victory, that the financial support of Torah will be precarious, but God has also given us a commandment of tzedakah to try to strengthen Torah and overcome that propensity. And it really is quite amazing because if you look at the amount of money that is available in the world for all sorts of projects, like you wonder, why is Torah so shortchanged, as it were? Why is there so little money for Torah compared to the resources that are devoted to entertainment and Assyrian studies and Hittite dictionaries and all sorts of things that really have, much, much less importance. But you see that there is a certain curse in which God is making us struggle. Let me just end with one final thought about this. So Yaakov then asks the angel, tell me your name. Tell me your name. Right? The angel tells Yaakov, I'm giving you a new name, or Hashem will give you a new name. But Yaakov asks the angel, tell me your name. And the angel's response is, Lama zeh tishal lishmi. Why are you asking my name? So the simple meaning is, as Rashi says, the angel says, I don't have a fixed name. My name depends on whatever job Hashem has assigned me to do. So sometimes it's one thing, sometimes it's something else. There is no name I could give you. That's what Rashi says. But Rabbi Chasman, one of the great Balei Musar, says, why are you asking my name is the name of the angel. The angel is called, why are you asking my name? The older folks undoubtedly think of Abbott and Costello, who's on first, exactly that who is the guy's name, etc. The angel's name is, why are you asking my name? What type of name is that? So Rabbi Chasman gave the following mashal. Rabbi Chasman said there was a Polish peasant who had never been to the big town, the big city, and he finally arrives at the big city and he's overwhelmed with all the different things that he sees. He buys a flashlight, etc. And then he's told if he buys a ticket and he goes into that building, it's a movie theater, he will see animals and people coming out of the walls. Amazingly. They will materialize out of a solid wall. He never heard of a movie, but this is how it was described to him. So he buys a ticket, he sits in a dark room, and all of a sudden, he sees animal and people coming out of the walls. He thinks they're actually coming out of the walls, and he didn't understand. He had walked by the wall when he was going to his seat, and he didn't see any doors. How did they get in? So he pulls out his big flashlight, and he shines it on the wall to get a better look about if there's any hidden entrances. But of course, when you shine a bright light on a movie screen, the picture either disappears or gets obscured. So people were screaming at him, and they said, shut your light, we can only see the picture when it's dark. Right? That's the story. Rabbi Chasman says, that is a mashal for Olam Hazeh. When you sit in darkness, symbolically, you don't think about the meaning of life, then all sorts of things look like they're real and significant, even though they're fake, whether it's power, whether it's money, whether it's accumulation of different things. It's like a movie. It looks so real, but it's not really there. On the other hand, when you're sitting in a dark movie theater, you could have a bag of diamonds on the next seat, and you may not even notice it. So darkness does two things. It makes you see things that aren't really there, and it takes away your ability to see things that are really there. When you turn on the lights, the opposite happens. That which isn't real disappears, and then you see what is real. And he said that symbolically turning on the lights is trying to understand what is important about life. So, going back to Yaakov. When Yaakov asks the angel, tell me your name, Yaakov is really asking the angel, what is your power? Because Kabbalistically, a name represents the spiritual power that you have. In fact, the Arizal even says, when parents name a baby, it is a prophecy from God regarding the nature of the baby's neshama. Now, we're not sensitive enough to the nuances of names to understand exactly the differences in the neshama, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, David, Esther, Sarah, whatever it is, but it is a prophecy that identifies a special koach of the neshama. That's why a name is a big deal. So, Yaakov is asking the angel, how do you trick people with the Yetzer Hara? How do you obscure people from seeing the truth in life? And the angel answers, my secret is, my name, my power is, nobody bothers to ask what I really am. Meaning they live in the darkness and they don't bother to turn on the lights. Lamaza, meaning if you don't ask, don't think about what I represent, you can be easily fooled and easily drawn into living based on frivolity and secondary ideas. So therefore, Yaakov asks, what's your power over people? Answer, people don't think. They don't ask. They don't pose questions. If they don't pose questions, they live a life of inertia in which you simply go with the flow and you get into certain patterns of destructive behavior and you never achieve what Hashem wants us to achieve in the world. Okay, so that's Rabbi Chasman's observation as to the name of Lama's Tishal Lishmi. Okay, wish you all well and have a good week.
Shama shir shir chadai